Every night my son calls with the same unsettling question. Dad, are you alone? I never understood why it mattered so much to him. I always told him the truth. Until yesterday. Yesterday, for the first time, I lied. Just one small, simple lie. And somehow, that lie changed everything. It saved my life. If you are watching this from a home you built with your own bare hands, listen closely. The most dangerous thief does not break your window. He walks through the front door using the key you gave him, and he calls you Dad. Before I continue this story, please let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth or took your love for granted. It brings a lot of comfort to this old builder's heart to know I am not speaking into the void. It was exactly 9 o'clock on a Friday night. The grandfather clock in the hallway had just finished its heavy chiming. I was sitting in my worn leather recliner, the one my late wife bought for me after I finished framing our very first extension on the house. The television was on with the volume low, just murmuring the local news to keep the silence of the big, empty house at bay. Outside the thick glass windows, my 30 acres of Texas farmland were swallowed by the pitch-black night. It is the kind of quiet that you only get way out here past the city limits. The kind of quiet that usually brings me peace. But lately, it had been bringing me an unshakable sense of dread. Right on schedule, the heavy phone on the side table buzzed. The bright screen lit up the dark corner of the room. The caller ID flashed the name Derek. My son. My 42-year-old boy. The same boy I had broken my back for working double shifts on construction sites in the sweltering southern heat, just so he could go to a fancy private college and wear tailored suits. Now he was a big-shot director at some tech startup downtown, driving expensive electric cars and drinking wine that costs more than my first truck. I stared at the phone for a few seconds before picking it up. I pressed the answer button and lifted it to my ear. I did not even get the chance to say hello. Dad, are you alone? There it was. He did not ask how my day was. He did not ask if my arthritis was flaring up in the cold weather. He did not ask if I had eaten dinner. Just those same 4 words. Dad, are you alone? He had been asking me this exact question every single night for the past month. At first I thought he was just being a good son, worrying about his 70-year-old father living all by himself on a massive property. I used to chuckle and tell him, yes, I am alone, safe and sound, reading a book or watching a game. But tonight, his voice sounded different. It was tight, rushed. The pitch of his voice was just a fraction higher than normal, like a man who was holding his breath while waiting for a coin to land. And in that moment, something deep inside my chest seized up. You do not survive 30 years on dangerous construction sites without developing a sixth sense for when a beam is about to snap or a trench is about to cave in. My gut was screaming at me. A cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. Are the doors locked, Dad? He pushed again, his tone edging on impatient. I looked around my quiet living room. I looked at the solid oak front door I had carved and hung myself. I looked at the shadows stretching across the hardwood floor. Why did he need to know so badly? Why did it feel like he was checking off a box on a list? Dad, are you there? Are you alone tonight? I opened my mouth fully intending to say yes, just like I had for the last 30 nights. But my throat closed up. My instincts took over. Instead of the truth, I let out a heavy sigh and rubbed the bridge of my nose. Actually, no. I am not alone tonight, Derek. The line went dead silent. I could hear the faint static of the cellular connection. I could hear his breathing stop. What do you mean you are not alone? His voice was suddenly sharp. It cut through the phone like a knife. Who is there with you? I kept my voice calm and casual, like I had no idea my heart was pounding against my ribs. Oh, my old union buddy Mike Sullivan is here. You remember Mike? His truck broke down on the interstate about 5 miles from the property. He gave me a call, so I drove out and picked him up. The tow truck cannot get the parts until Monday, so he is sleeping on the couch tonight. We just finished a couple of beers. The silence that followed was heavy. It was not the silence of a relieved son glad his father had company. It was the silence of a man whose carefully laid plans had just been thrown off a cliff. Mike is staying the night. Derek repeated. His words were flat and completely drained of emotion. Yeah, I replied, leaning forward in my chair. He is right here in the kitchen making a sandwich. Do you want me to put him on the phone? You two have not spoken since your mother passed away. No. No, do not bother him, Derek said quickly, his voice trembling just a fraction. I am just glad you are not alone. That is good. That is really good. Listen, Dad, I have got to go. I have a late meeting. Lock the doors. Good night. He hung up before I could even say the word goodbye. I slowly pulled the phone away from my ear. The screen went dark, plunging the room back into shadows. The silence of the house rushed back in, but it felt suffocating now. I sat completely still, gripping the arms of my chair, trying to process what had just happened. Why had my son sounded so angry and so terrified that an old friend was staying with me? Then I heard it. It started as a low, throbbing hum out in the darkness. Outside my window, about a quarter mile down the long dirt driveway, right where my heavy iron front gate stood. The engine of a heavy vehicle suddenly roared to life. It had been idling out there in the pitch-black night, completely dark and waiting. I stood up, my joints popping, and walked slowly to the large bay window. I peered out through the glass. Out by the gate, tires screeched violently against the asphalt. The sound tore through the quiet country night like a scream. I saw the sudden blinding flash of red taillights as a vehicle slammed into reverse, completely changing direction in a panic. The engine revved so hard it sounded like it was going to explode, and then the tires peeled out, spitting gravel and dust into the air as the car sped away down the dark county road, disappearing into the night. My breath caught in my throat. Someone had been sitting right outside my property line. Someone waiting in the dark. Waiting for my son to make a phone call. Waiting for the confirmation that the old man was all alone in his big, empty house. I did not turn on the living room lights. I did not call the police. Instead, I turned around and walked quietly down the hall toward my bedroom, heading straight for the heavy steel lockbox under my bed, where I kept my old Remington shotgun. My son thought I was just an old, clueless man waiting to die. But tomorrow, he was going to find out that a builder knows exactly how to tear things down. I walked slowly into my bedroom. The air in the house felt heavy and completely still. I knelt beside the solid oak bed frame that I had built by hand over 30 years ago. Underneath it was the heavy steel lockbox. I reached down and carefully punched in the combination. The familiar cold steel of my old 12-gauge Remington shotgun greeted my hands. I bought this weapon back in the late 70s when I was framing houses down in South Texas. Back then, the job sites were rough and isolated. You had to protect your tools and your life from drifters and thieves. I checked the chamber with a practiced motion. It was fully loaded and ready. I did not turn on a single light. I did not need to. I built this sprawling farmhouse from the ground up. Every single room and every hallway and every doorframe was born from my own sweat and calloused hands. I know the exact layout of this place better than I know my own heartbeat. I know which floorboards creak under the weight of a heavy footstep. The third plank in the hallway groans if you step on the left side. The bottom stair of the landing settles with a sharp crack when the temperature drops. If anyone tried to sneak into my home tonight, they would be walking blind into a fortress built by a man who knows every single vulnerability. I took my shotgun and walked silently back out to the living room. I sat down in my worn leather recliner, facing the thick oak front door. The house was completely silent again. My eyes slowly adjusted to the darkness. I sat there for hours, just me and my memories and the cold, heavy metal resting across my lap. My mind raced through the past as I waited in the shadows. I thought about the grueling days I spent pouring the concrete foundation for this house. My late wife Martha used to bring me cold lemonade while I worked in the blistering Texas sun. We bought these 30 acres just outside Austin, when it was nothing but cheap dirt and scrub brush. We dreamed of a quiet and simple life far away from the noise of the city. We planted the trees together. We painted the walls together. This house was our entire world. Now the city has expanded. The massive tech boom has turned our quiet little sanctuary into prime real estate worth an absolute fortune. A massive fortune that my son suddenly seems very interested in controlling. I sat perfectly still and listened. I focused on the sounds of the property. I heard the wind rustling the branches of the ancient oak trees outside the window. I heard the distant call of a nightbird. Every time the wind blew against the side of the house, my grip tightened on the weapon. I was waiting for the sound of shattering glass. I was waiting for the heavy thud of a boot kicking in the back door. I played through every possible scenario in my mind. Derek was an arrogant man, but he was not a violent man by nature. He liked clean hands and expensive suits. If he wanted to harm me, he would never do the dirty work himself. He would hire someone. He would pay someone to make my death look like a tragic accident. An old man living alone out in the country is an easy target for a tragic accident. A house fire. A bad fall down the wooden stairs. A robbery gone wrong. I refused to be a victim in my own home. I refused to let my own flesh and blood erase my life just to cash a check. The long night crept by slowly. I did not sleep a single wink. I just sat there breathing evenly and watching the shadows shift across the floor. Finally, the sky outside the large bay window began to turn a pale shade of gray. The long, suffocating night was ending. Dawn was breaking over the Texas hills. The immediate danger for the night had passed. The cowards who run and hide in the dark rarely stay around when the morning sun comes up. I slowly stood up and stretched my stiff back. My joints ached from sitting in the cold room for so long. I placed the shotgun securely behind the heavy front door, where it would be out of sight but easy to reach. I walked into the mudroom and put on my heavy leather work boots. I opened the front door and stepped out onto the porch. The morning air was crisp and freezing cold against my face. I walked down the long dirt driveway toward the heavy iron gate at the edge of my property line. My boots crunched loudly against the loose gravel. When I finally reached the gate, I stopped and looked down at the smooth asphalt of the county road. There they were. Deep and wide black tire tracks violently burned into the road surface. The smell of scorched rubber still lingered faintly in the cold morning air. I knelt down on the cold ground to examine the dark marks. The tread pattern was wide and aggressive. It was the exact kind of tire you see on a heavy luxury sport utility vehicle. But that was not all I found out there. Lying just a few inches from the tire tracks, resting quietly in the dust and gravel, was a discarded cigarette butt. I reached out and picked it up with my thick fingers. It was not some cheap convenience store brand that a random teenager or a common burglar would smoke. It had a very distinct gold band wrapped around the filter. It was an extremely expensive imported brand. It was the exact same expensive luxury brand of cigarettes that Derek and his wealthy tech startup investor friends always smoked when they used to visit my home. I rolled the small paper cylinder between my thumb and forefinger. The gold band caught the morning sunlight. I slipped the cigarette butt into my pocket just as a low humming sound approached from down the road. It was almost completely silent. I looked up and saw the black Tesla gliding toward my property line. It was my son Derek and his wife Megan. They rarely visited unless it was a holiday or they needed a favor. I watched as the heavy doors swung upward and they stepped out into the crisp air. Derek wore a polo shirt and sunglasses. Megan dressed in a white blazer holding a coffee cup. They looked ready for a photo shoot, not a visit to an old farm. I stayed by the gate and waited. I forced my face to relax. I let my shoulders drop. I put on the mask of a tired old man. Derek rushed over with concern plastered across his face. He grabbed my arm a little too tightly. "Dad, are you okay? I tried calling last night, but it went to voicemail. You had me worried sick." Megan stepped up and placed a manicured hand on my shoulder. "We came as soon as we woke up, Richard. Are you all right out here all by yourself?" I gave them a reassuring smile. "I am fine," I said softly. But something strange happened last night after we spoke. I pointed down at the scorched black tire marks scarring the asphalt inches from their expensive shoes. "I think I had a prowler. Some lunatic came speeding up to the gate and slammed on the brakes, scared the living daylights out of me. Then they backed up and peeled out. You can still smell the burned rubber." Derek looked down at the tracks. His jaw tightened for a fraction of a second. It was a microscopic slip, but I caught it. Then the fake panic washed back over his features. "Oh my God, Dad. A prowler. Did they try to jump the fence? Did you call the sheriff?" I shook my head slowly. No, I did not want to make a fuss over teenagers out joyriding. But it did make me nervous. Derek pulled out his phone. "Let me check the security cameras right now. I installed that system for you last year for exactly this reason. We will get their license plate and give it to the police." He tapped rapidly on his screen while Megan hovered over his shoulder. I watched him carefully. I knew he controlled the master account. I knew he had access to every camera on my property. After a few moments of fake typing, he let out an exaggerated sigh of frustration. He turned the phone screen toward me. It showed a black screen with a small white loading circle spinning. "Damn it, Dad. The feed is dead. The optic cable must have worn out again. You see this? Nothing recorded. The entire system went offline yesterday afternoon. I will have to call the tech company on Monday to lay down new wiring. I am so sorry. You have zero footage of whatever happened last night." I looked at the black screen, and then I looked right into his dark eyes. The eyes of the boy I taught how to ride a bicycle. The boy I taught how to fish. He was lying straight to my face without a single ounce. "That is a shame," I muttered softly. "I guess it was just bad timing." Megan stepped forward and wrapped her hands around my right hand. Her skin was soft, but her grip felt like a cold iron trap. Her tone dripped with artificial sweetness. "Richard, this is exactly what we have been talking about. This neighborhood is getting too dangerous. The city is creeping closer and bringing crime with it. You are 70 years old. You should not be out here dealing with prowlers and broken security systems in the middle of the night all by yourself. It is just not safe anymore." Derek nodded, crossing his arms over his chest. "Megan is right, Dad. We love you too much to see something terrible happen to you out here." I looked back and forth between the two of them. Their synchronized concern was flawlessly rehearsed. Megan squeezed my hand again and leaned in closer. Her voice lowered into a comforting whisper. "You should really consider selling this farm, Richard. It is too much upkeep for one person. You should move into the Oakwood luxury assisted living apartments. They are beautiful. They have a heated pool and 24-hour armed security. It is right down the street from our house. We could visit you every single day. You would never have to worry about a thing." Derek chimed in right on cue. "We will handle all the paperwork for you, Dad. Megan is a top real estate agent. She knows the market better than anyone. She can get this property appraised and listed by next week. We will take care of all the heavy lifting. All you have to do is sign the papers and relax." I stood there listening to their perfectly crafted pitch. It was brilliant. They had created the problem last night, and now they were arriving as the saviors with the perfect solution today. Sell the land. Hand over the paperwork. Give them control of the 30-acre gold mine. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. The sheer audacity of their greed was staggering. They wanted to strip away my home, my memories, and my independence, and they expected me to thank them for it. I gently pulled my hand out of her grasp. I gave them the exact answer they wanted to hear. You know what, Megan? You might be right. Maybe this place is getting to be too much for me. Let me think about it over the weekend. They smiled warmly. The trap was set. I looked right back at them both. But I knew I could not give them exactly what they wanted right this second. I appreciate the offer, Derek, but I am not signing anything today. I am not making any final decisions this morning. I need to sleep on it. I need to walk the property a few more times before I sign away 30 years of my life. The warm smiles on their faces instantly froze. It was subtle, but I saw the muscles in Megan's jaw tighten. She shot a quick, panicked look at my son. Derek let out a sharp breath through his nose. Dad, we do not have an infinite amount of time here. The real estate market is volatile. If you wait too long, you might miss the window to get a good price for this old place. And frankly, we are worried about your safety tonight. I shook my head and crossed my arms over my chest, playing the part of the stubborn old mule perfectly. I said I will think about it over the weekend, Derek. That is my final answer. I would like to go inside and rest. Derek checked the heavy gold watch on his wrist and cursed loudly under his breath. He looked up at Megan. We need to leave now. We are already running late for that massive business brunch with the venture capital guys. If we do not close this round of funding, the startup is going to hit a brick wall. Megan nodded quickly, her eyes darting nervously. Okay, Richard. You get some rest. We will call you tomorrow morning. Please keep the doors locked tight. They turned around and sprinted back toward their shiny black Tesla. Derek was already pulling his cell phone out of his pocket and dialing a number before he even reached the driver door. He was distracted and frantic. He threw his suit jacket into the back seat and slid behind the steering wheel. Megan slammed her door shut. The electric engine whined to life, and they sped off down the dirt driveway, kicking up a huge cloud of gray dust. They were in a massive hurry. I stood on the porch until the dust settled and the car disappeared from sight. Then I turned around and walked back inside my quiet house. I locked the heavy oak door behind me and slid the thick metal deadbolt firmly into place. I walked down the hallway and stepped into the kitchen to pour myself a cup of black coffee. My hands were shaking slightly from the adrenaline of the morning confrontation. That is when I saw it. Resting right there on the smooth granite surface of my kitchen island was a sleek silver tablet. Derek had set his iPad down next to the fruit bowl when he was showing me the fake broken camera footage, and in his frantic rush to leave for his business brunch, he had completely forgotten to pick it up. I slowly walked over to the kitchen island and stared down at the expensive piece of glass and metal. My son always treated me like a technological dinosaur. Whenever he bought me a new phone or a smart television, he would sigh and roll his eyes, explaining the most basic functions as if I were a toddler. He genuinely believed that because I worked with my hands and wore dirty steel toe boots, I possessed the brain of a caveman. What my arrogant son completely forgot was that for the last 20 years of my career as a master builder, I used advanced computer-aided design software to draft complex architectural blueprints. I knew my way around an operating system just fine. I set my coffee mug down on the counter and reached for the tablet. I tapped the dark screen with my index finger. The display instantly lit up. It was not locked. Derek had disabled the automatic screen lock while he was at home. The screen displayed his personal email inbox. I swiped up from the bottom of the screen, closing the email application. I was not entirely sure what I was looking for. Maybe I wanted to find an email thread between him and Megan discussing how much money they could strip from my estate. Maybe I wanted to find a brochure for that luxury assisted living facility to see how quickly they planned to lock me away. I tapped on his web browser history. I scrolled through his recent searches. Nothing but expensive restaurants and stock market tracking. I was just about to open his financial documents folder when the device vibrated violently against the granite countertop. A sharp chime echoed through the silent kitchen. A banner notification dropped down from the very top of the bright screen. It was a text message from a blocked and unsaved phone number. I did not have to open the message to read it. The bold black text was fully visible right there on the lock screen. My breath caught in my throat. I leaned in closer and read the words over and over again, making sure my old tired eyes were not playing tricks on me. The message read exactly as follows. Mission aborted last night. You said the old man was alone. We charged double for rescheduling the accident. Let us know when the target is clear. The air in the kitchen suddenly felt freezing. My chest tightened so hard I thought my ribs were going to crack. The horrific truth hit me like a runaway freight train. The tire tracks, the discarded cigarette butt, the frantic phone call asking if I was alone. Derek was not checking on me because he loved me. My own flesh and blood had hired a professional hitman. My son did not just want to sell my farm or take my money. He wanted me dead. I stared at the glowing screen alone with the darkest truth a father could ever face. I grabbed the tablet off the granite counter. My hands were no longer shaking. I walked down the hall and stepped into my home office. I shut the heavy wooden door behind me and turned the brass lock. I sat down at my heavy oak desk, the very same desk where I used to draft blueprints and calculate lumber costs. I placed the silver device right in the center of the leather blotter. Derek thought I was a fool. He thought his basic passwords could keep me out. But people who think they are smarter than everyone else always make the most obvious mistakes. I opened his main email application. It prompted me for a secondary security PIN. I did not even have to guess twice. I typed in the birthday of his golden retriever. The screen flashed green and let me in. The arrogance of the man was staggering. He hired men to kill me, but he protected his digital life with the name of a dog. I began to scroll through his primary inbox. At first, it was just mundane business correspondence. But then I noticed a hidden folder buried at the very bottom of the menu. It was labeled simply as Urgent Matters. I tapped the folder, and a cascade of frantic messages flooded the screen. They were not from business partners. They were from angry, desperate investors. I opened the first message. It was a vicious threat demanding the immediate return of $2 million. The sender claimed Derek had been falsifying quarterly profit reports for the last 3 years. I opened another message from a different investor. It accused Derek of using new funds to pay off early backers. My heart pounded against my ribs as the puzzle pieces finally clicked together in my mind. My son was not running a legitimate technology startup. He was running a massive fraudulent Ponzi scheme. He was stealing millions of dollars to his luxurious lifestyle. He bought the sports cars and the designer suits with stolen money. And now the entire house of cards was violently collapsing around him. I dug deeper into the hidden folder. I found a chain of emails forwarded from a high-powered defense attorney. The subject line read, Notice of Impending Federal Action. The Securities and Exchange Commission had officially opened a federal investigation into his company. The government auditors had subpoenaed his financial records. They knew the accounts were completely empty. The lawyer was warning him that federal indictments were going to be unsealed by the end of the month. Derek was facing decades in federal prison for massive wire fraud, but there was a small sliver of hope offered by the lawyer. The attorney stated that if Derek could somehow inject $10 million of liquid cash into the corporate accounts before the federal audit next Wednesday, he could theoretically pay back the primary complainants. If the most vocal victims were paid off and silenced, the attorney could negotiate a civil settlement and keep him out of a jail cell. Next Wednesday. That was the absolute deadline. That was the ticking clock hanging over his head. I leaned back in my heavy leather chair and let out a long, slow breath. I turned my head and looked out the large glass window of my office. The morning sun was shining brightly over the sprawling green fields of my property. 30 acres of prime, untouched real estate sitting right on the edge of the fastest-growing tech hub in the country. A decade ago, this land was just a quiet retreat. Today, it was a gold mine. I knew exactly what this property was worth. Developers had been sending me letters for years, offering upwards of $12 million just to bulldoze my home and build luxury subdivisions. $12 million. More than enough to pay off the angry investors. More than enough to make the federal investigators go away. I looked back down at the glowing screen on my desk. Everything finally made perfect, terrifying sense. My son was drowning. He looked around for a life raft, and he saw the 30 acres I had bled to build. But there was a massive obstacle in his way. I was still alive. I held the deed to the property, and I had made it very clear that I would never sell the farm as long as I had breath in my lungs, and I fully intended to keep breathing for a very long time to come. To save his own life, he had to end mine. If I died in a tragic accident, he would instantly inherit the entire estate as my sole surviving heir. He could liquidate the land in a matter of days. He would have the $10 million in cash by next Wednesday. He would pay off his debts and walk away completely free. The sheer calculating evil of it all made my stomach turn. I was no longer a father to him. I was just an obstacle standing between him and his freedom. I was a human bank account that needed to be forcibly closed. I slowly reached out and turned the tablet off. The screen faded to black, leaving only my reflection in the dark glass. I looked at the deep lines on my face. I looked at the calluses on my hands. I had spent my entire life protecting and providing for that boy. I had sacrificed my own comfort to make sure he had every possible advantage in this world. And this was my reward. A death sentence delivered by the child I raised. I stood up from my desk. I grabbed my old shotgun and walked out into the empty hallway. The sadness in my chest hardened into a solid block of ice. He wanted a bloody war for this land. He was about to get exactly the kind of destructive war he asked for from a man with nothing to lose. I stood in the quiet hallway with the shotgun resting against my leg. My heart was completely calm now. The initial shock had burned away, leaving nothing but a cold and calculated focus. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my cell phone. I bypassed my contacts and manually dialed a number I had known by heart for over 30 years. It rang 3 times before a gruff, familiar voice answered. It was Mike Sullivan. Mike and I used to run framing crews together back in the late 80s. He was the toughest foreman I ever knew, a man who demanded perfection and loyalty. When the housing market crashed years ago, Mike pivoted. He took his knowledge of structural vulnerabilities and opened a high-end private security firm in downtown Austin. He protected wealthy clients from the exact kind of scum my son had become. I did not bother with pleasantries. I told him I had a massive problem. I told him I needed his best equipment right now. I warned him not to use the main road. If Derek had spotters watching the property, I could not afford to tip my hand. I told Mike to park his unmarked truck a mile down the county road and hike in through the dense woods at the back of my property. Mike did not ask a single question. He just told me to keep my doors locked and hung up. I spent the next hour pacing the length of my living room. I kept my eyes fixed on the tree line visible through the rear kitchen windows. The sun climbed higher into the clear blue Texas sky, mocking the dark reality I was trapped inside. Finally, I saw a shadow detach itself from the thick brush. Mike stepped out of the woods, moving with the silent grace of a man who knew exactly how to stay unseen. He carried a heavy black case. I unlocked the back door and let him inside. We did not hug. We just exchanged a firm nod. He looked around the quiet kitchen, and then his eyes settled on the shotgun leaning against the wall. He set his heavy case down on the kitchen table and asked me what was going on. I did not say a word. I simply handed him the silver tablet. I watched his weathered face as he read the text message from the hitman. I watched his jaw tighten as he scrolled through the frantic emails from the angry investors and the federal investigators. When he finally set the device down, his eyes were filled with a dangerous and violent anger. He looked at me and shook his head. He could not believe that the boy he used to buy ice cream for had grown into a monster willing to murder his own father for a piece of real estate. Mike unlatched his heavy black case and flipped it open. Inside was a dense array of wires, diagnostic laptops, and scanning equipment. He pulled out a small silver device and plugged it into a compact computer. Then he asked me where the main control hub for the home security system was located. I led him down the hall to the utility closet. Derek had insisted on installing a state-of-the-art wireless camera system last year. At the time, I thought it was a beautiful gesture from a caring son. Now I knew it was a digital leash designed to monitor my every move. Mike knelt down on the hardwood floor and connected his diagnostic laptop directly to the primary router. His fingers moved rapidly across the keyboard. Lines of green code began scrolling down the black screen. I stood behind him, leaning against the doorframe. I asked him if the optic cable was really broken like Derek claimed. Mike let out a bitter laugh. He told me that modern security systems like this one do not just break without triggering a dozen different fail-safes and automatic alerts. He said he was digging into the internal log files. These files are like a digital footprint. They record every single command sent to the cameras, and they cannot be erased remotely without leaving a massive and obvious gap in the system memory. We waited in absolute silence as the progress bar slowly crept across the screen. The only sound in the house was the faint whirring of the laptop cooling fan. Then the screen flashed blue. A long list of timestamps and technical commands appeared. Mike stopped typing and leaned closer to the monitor. He pointed a thick, calloused finger at a specific line of text near the bottom of the screen. He told me to look at the data. I leaned over his shoulder. The text clearly showed a remote override command had been sent to the main system hub. The cameras were not broken. They had been manually deactivated from the outside. I asked Mike where the command came from. He tapped a few more keys and pulled up the device registry. The command was sent directly from the master administrator account. It was sent from the personal cell phone of my son. My chest tightened as Mike highlighted the exact timestamp of the system shutdown. The cameras were turned off at exactly 8:55 in the evening, just 5 minutes before my son called me to ask if I was sitting all alone in the dark. The betrayal was complete and absolute. Derek had intentionally blinded the house to give those killers a clear path to my front door. He had orchestrated the entire nightmare from his luxury apartment. Mike closed the laptop and looked up at me. He asked me what I wanted to do next. I told him we needed to move fast. Before those bulldozers could arrive on Monday, I needed to find out exactly how much damage my son had already done on paper. I needed to see the county clerk. The weekend passed in a tense and suffocating blur. Mike and his security team spent 48 hours turning my quiet farmhouse into an invisible digital fortress. By the time Monday morning broke, I was exhausted, but running on pure adrenaline. I walked out to my old truck and climbed inside. The engine sputtered and roared to life. My cell phone buzzed in my pocket for the 5th time since sunrise. I pulled it out and looked at the glowing screen. It was Derek. He was probably calling to check if his old man was still breathing, or if he had decided to sign the paperwork for the assisted living facility. I silenced the device and tossed it onto the passenger seat. I backed out of the long dirt driveway and steered the truck toward downtown Austin. I had a very specific mission today. I was not going to wait for my son to make another violent move. I was going to the county clerk office to lock my property away. My plan was simple but bulletproof. I was going to transfer the deed of my farm into an irrevocable legal trust. Once the land was locked inside the trust, Derek would never be able to touch a single blade of grass. I drove through the bustling city streets, watching the towering cranes building new skyscrapers. This city was swallowing everything in its path, and my son was trying to feed me to the beast. I parked my truck in the concrete garage and walked 2 blocks to the county building. The air inside was stale and smelled like old paper and floor cleaner. I pulled a paper ticket from the red dispenser and sat down on a hard wooden bench. I watched the busy clerks shuffling files and stamping official documents behind thick glass partitions. I felt a quiet sense of satisfaction building in my chest. By the time I walked out of these doors, my son would be completely powerless. His massive $10 million debt would crush him, and he would have to face the federal investigators entirely on his own. "Number 42, please." A tired voice echoed through the overhead speaker. I stood up and walked over to counter number 3. A middle-aged woman with thick glasses and a kind smile greeted me. "Good morning, sir. How can I help you today?" I slid my driver license under the glass partition. "Good morning," I replied politely. "My name is Richard Lawson. I own a 30-acre property just outside the city limits. I need to pull the official master deed for my property. I am meeting with my lawyer this afternoon to transfer the entire estate into a secure living trust." The clerk smiled and typed my information into her computer. "Let me pull that right up for you, Mr. Lawson." She hummed a quiet tune as she clicked her mouse. Suddenly her humming stopped, her brow furrowed behind her thick glasses. She leaned closer to the monitor and clicked the mouse a few more times. Her kind smile faded into a look of genuine confusion. She looked up at me and then back down at her screen. "Mr. Lawson, are you sure about the address?" I nodded, feeling a cold knot form in my stomach. "Yes, ma'am. I built the house myself 30 years ago. I know the address." She sighed and turned the monitor slightly, as if that would change the information on the screen. "Sir, I am afraid there must be some sort of misunderstanding. You cannot transfer this property into a living trust today. You cannot put it into a trust because you do not own it anymore." The air rushed out of my lungs. I gripped the edge of the counter to steady my legs. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice suddenly hoarse. "I paid off the mortgage 20 years ago. I hold the deed." The clerk gave me a sympathetic look and reached for a stack of paper. "Let me print the latest official filing for you, sir." The heavy printer behind her whirred and spat out 3 pages of dense legal text. She slid the warm papers under the glass partition. According to the county records, this entire 30-acre parcel was legally transferred and sold exactly 1 month ago to a commercial development group for $12 million. The sale has already been fully processed and recorded by the city. The title has officially changed hands. I stared blindly at the papers in my hand. $12 million. The exact amount of money Derek needed to cover his massive federal fraud case and still have $2 million left over to buy himself a new life. I forced my shaking eyes to focus on the black ink. I flipped to the final page of the contract where the signatures were located. And there it was. Staring back at me was my own name. Richard Lawson. The signature was absolutely perfect. Every loop and slant matched my handwriting flawlessly. If I had not known the truth, I would have sworn under oath that I held the pen myself. My son had practiced my signature until he mastered it. But a forged signature is not enough to transfer a multi-million-dollar piece of real estate. You need a legally certified witness. You need a notary public to stamp the document and swear under penalty of perjury that they watched the owner sign the papers in person. I dragged my eyes to the bottom right corner of the page. There was a bright blue notary stamp pressed into the paper. I read the name printed inside the blue circle. It was a woman named Sarah, but the name was not what made my blood run cold. It was the listed address of the notary. It was the exact corporate address of the real estate brokerage where my daughter-in-law Megan worked. They had stolen my life. I folded the heavy county documents and shoved them deep into the inner pocket of my worn canvas jacket. I did not say another word to the kind clerk behind the glass partition. I turned around and walked out of the building. The bright Texas sunlight felt harsh and unforgiving against my face. My entire world had just been legally erased with a forged signature and a fraudulent stamp. I climbed back into my truck and gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned completely white. A weaker man might have driven straight to the police station to file a report. But I knew how the justice system worked. If I walked in there right now with just a piece of paper, Derek would hire an army of expensive corporate lawyers. He would claim I signed the deed in a moment of clarity and simply forgot because of my old age. I needed more than just a forged document to destroy them. I needed to know exactly what their timeline was. I turned the key in the ignition and steered the truck toward the wealthy financial district downtown. I parked down the street from the shimmering glass tower that housed Megan and her luxury real estate brokerage. The building was a monument to corporate greed. I pushed through the heavy revolving doors and stepped into the opulent lobby. The floors were polished white marble, and the air smelled heavily of expensive perfume and fresh espresso. I looked entirely out of place in my faded denim jeans and heavy work boots. A security guard eyed me suspiciously from his podium. I kept my head down and walked straight over to a sleek waiting area filled with modern leather chairs. I grabbed a large financial newspaper from a glass coffee table and sat down in a high-backed armchair, positioned right next to a row of open-concept glass offices. I snapped the newspaper open wide, completely concealing my face. I sat perfectly still and listened to the sharp clicking of high heels and the low hum of million-dollar negotiations happening all around me. I did not have to wait very long. After about 20 minutes, I heard a familiar high-pitched laugh echoing down the marble corridor. It was Megan. I recognized her arrogant tone instantly. I shifted the newspaper just a fraction of an inch and peered through the narrow gap. She was walking side by side with a younger female agent holding a customized coffee cup and looking absolutely triumphant. She wore a tailored designer suit that probably cost more than my first truck. They stopped right outside the glass office closest to my chair. Megan took a sip of her coffee and leaned casually against the doorframe. The younger agent was looking at her with total admiration. "I cannot believe you pulled off that commercial land deal so quietly," the young woman said, shaking her head. "The whole office is talking about your commission. You bypassed the entire open market." Megan laughed again, tossing her perfectly styled hair over her shoulder. It was all about timing and having the right connections, she bragged. The commercial development group was desperate for a massive plot of land near the new highway expansion. I knew about a 30-acre farm that was completely off the grid. The owner is my father-in-law. He is getting extremely old and honestly a bit senile. He finally realized the property was too much for him to handle, so Derek and I stepped in to facilitate the transition. We handled all the difficult legal paperwork to spare him the stress. The developers were thrilled to bypass the public bidding war. They signed the $12 million contract last month without a single complaint. It was a genius off-market deal, and my commission is already secured in escrow. The younger agent sighed enviously. "That is incredible, Megan. When do the buyers actually take possession of the land?" Megan lowered her voice just a little bit, but I could still hear every single poisonous word. "The developers are sending their heavy bulldozers to clear the property early next Monday morning. They are eager to break ground on the new subdivision. Derek and I are moving the old man into a permanent assisted living facility this weekend before the construction crews arrive. Once the property is officially vacated on Monday, the massive wire transfer clears directly into a private offshore account Derek set up. Everything is going perfectly according to plan. We are taking a long vacation to Europe next month to celebrate." They giggled and walked away toward the elevators, leaving me sitting alone in the cold lobby. I slowly lowered the newspaper and placed it back onto the glass coffee table. My heart was pounding with a slow and rhythmic intensity. The entire puzzle was finally assembled in my mind. The developers had absolutely no idea they were participating in a massive criminal fraud. They genuinely believed they had purchased the 30 acres legally from a willing seller. But the money was not in the hands of my son yet. The $12 million was sitting locked in an escrow account waiting for the physical transfer of the property. Derek and Megan needed me completely out of the picture before the bulldozers arrived on Monday morning. If I was still sitting in my house when the construction crews showed up, the developers would realize the sale was a sham. The escrow would freeze and Derek would default on his federal fraud deadline next Wednesday. I had exactly 6 days left to dismantle their entire operation. I stood up from the comfortable leather chair and walked out of the opulent building. The bright sun hit my face again, but this time I did not flinch. It was time to go on the attack. I pulled my phone out and dialed the number of the most ruthless lawyer I had known in my 30 years. I held the phone to my ear and listened to the steady ringing over the heavy city traffic. Benjamin Carter answered on the second ring. He was not the kind of lawyer you called to draft a simple will or handle a minor traffic ticket. He was a corporate bulldog with a reputation for dismantling his opponents with surgical precision. I told him I needed to see him immediately. He heard the coldness in my voice and told me to come up to his office on the 50th floor. I walked 2 blocks and entered another towering skyscraper made of steel and glass. The elevator ride was silent and fast. I stepped out into a massive reception area with panoramic views of the city. I marched past the front desk without speaking to the assistants. I pushed open the heavy oak doors of his private office. Benjamin was sitting behind his massive mahogany desk, wearing a dark charcoal suit. He looked up from his paperwork and studied my face. We had known each other for decades. He represented me when I bought the farm and helped navigate complex zoning laws when the city tried to encroach on my land. He knew I never panicked over small things. I walked over to his desk and reached into my heavy canvas jacket. I pulled out the folded county documents I had just obtained from the clerk and tossed them flat onto the polished wood. I told him to look at the final page. Benjamin picked up the papers and began to read. He read with the silent and focused intensity of a predator studying its prey. When he reached the final page, he stopped. His eyes locked onto the perfect forgery of my signature and the blue notary stamp. He set the documents down and leaned back in his heavy leather chair. He asked me if I signed this deed. I told him I had never seen that paper in my entire life until an hour ago. I explained the entire situation to him. I told him about the frantic phone calls from my son, asking if I was alone. I told him about the tire tracks by my front gate and the discarded imported cigarette. I told him about the hidden emails on the tablet, detailing the massive federal investigation into the fraudulent technology startup. Finally, I told him about the conversation I overheard in the lobby, revealing that commercial bulldozers were scheduled to demolish my home on Monday morning. Benjamin listened to every single word without interrupting me once. When I finished speaking, he took a deep breath and looked out the window. He told me we had enough evidence right now to file criminal charges for fraud and forgery. We could stop the sale and protect the farm today, but he warned me that doing so would be a massive strategic mistake. He turned his sharp eyes back to me and explained exactly how the legal system would handle it. If we went to the local authorities right now, with just a forged document, Derek would immediately hire a team of aggressive defense attorneys. They would drag the case out for years in civil court. Worse yet, Derek could easily claim that his wife Megan orchestrated the entire real estate transaction without his knowledge. He could throw her under the bus to save himself from federal prison. He might even plead down to a lesser charge and walk away with a slap on the wrist, while I spent the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, wondering when he would try again. I felt a surge of hot anger rising in my chest, but I kept my voice perfectly level. I asked Benjamin what we needed to do to make sure my son never saw the light of day again. A slow and calculated smile spread across the face of the ruthless lawyer. He told me that if we wanted to destroy them completely, we could not just cut off the branch. We had to pull the tree up by the roots. We needed to catch Derek in the absolute middle of his desperate and violent conspiracy. We needed federal agents to witness him committing an undeniable felony with his own two hands. We had to let him believe that his terrible plan was still working flawlessly. Benjamin opened a drawer in his heavy mahogany desk and pulled out a fresh legal pad. He picked up a gold pen and started writing down a timeline. He explained that federal investigators were already breathing down the neck of my son because of his massive financial crimes. If we handed the Federal Bureau of Investigation a silver platter showing wire fraud, attempted murder, and conspiracy, they would lock him away in a maximum security prison for the rest of his natural life. Our strategy was to set a trap so tight that no expensive lawyer could ever talk him out of it. We decided that I would go back to the farm and play the perfect victim. I would act like the tired, confused old man they desperately wanted me to be. I would give Derek the green light to make his final move. Meanwhile, Benjamin would take my evidence and make a very quiet phone call to his contacts at the federal prosecutor office. We would arrange a welcome party for my son when he finally decided to come out to the property and finish the job himself. I looked at the legal pad and nodded my head slowly. The plan we created was incredibly dangerous and risky. I was offering myself as live bait to a man who had already proven he wanted me dead. But I was not afraid anymore. I shook hands with Benjamin and walked out of his office with a renewed sense of purpose. The long waiting game was finally over. I was going back to my 30-acre fortress to prepare for war. The drive back from downtown Austin to my quiet farm felt entirely different this time. The crushing weight of betrayal that had suffocated me all weekend was completely gone. In its place was a cold and calculating clarity. I steered my heavy truck off the main highway and turned onto the familiar dirt road that led to my property. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long, dark shadows across the sprawling fields. I slowed the truck to a crawl as I approached my heavy iron front gate. Before turning into the driveway, I stopped. I shifted the truck into the park and stepped out into the warm afternoon air. I walked over to the old rusted metal mailbox sitting on a wooden post beside the road. I opened the creaking door and pulled out a thick stack of paper. Most of it was the usual pile of colorful junk mail, grocery store flyers, and random catalogs. I flipped through the stack absent-mindedly as I walked back to the driver's side door. But right in the middle of the pile, a crisp white envelope caught my eye. It looked incredibly official and completely out of place. I paused with my hand on the door handle and slid the white envelope out from the middle of the stack. The postage stamp was perfectly placed, but the delivery address was smeared by the sorting machine. The mail carrier had accidentally dropped it into my box instead of forwarding it to the city. My heart skipped a heavy beat when I read the printed name on the front. It was addressed directly to my son, Derek. I looked up at the return address stamped in bold black ink in the top left corner. It was a private psychiatric clinic. The name of the clinic sent a sudden chill down my spine. It was a notoriously expensive private facility located on the far north side of the city. It was the kind of place where wealthy families sent their inconvenient relatives to be locked away quietly out of public view. I did not care that opening another person's mail was technically a federal offense. My son was already trying to have me murdered for my land. I slid my thick thumb under the glued flap of the envelope and tore it open standing next to my heavy old work truck. I pulled out 3 pages of thick premium paper fastened together with a silver staple. The letterhead bore the official seal of a licensed psychiatric specialist. I leaned against the warm metal of my truck and began to read the dense medical terminology. The document was a comprehensive psychological evaluation, but it was not an evaluation of my son. My own name was printed at the very top of the page in bold black letters. Patient name Richard Lawson, age 70. The doctor claimed to have conducted a thorough series of cognitive behavioral assessments on me this past month. Unbelievable. I stared at the words in absolute disbelief. I had not been to a doctor in over 2 years, let alone a high-priced city psychiatrist. But the fabricated report detailed a tragic and rapid mental decline. It described instances of severe memory loss, paranoia, and violent outbursts. The doctor wrote that I was unable to distinguish reality from delusion. I flipped to the second page, my hands gripping the paper so tightly that the edges began to wrinkle. The concluding paragraph was the most terrifying thing I had ever read in my entire 70 years on this quiet earth. The doctor definitively diagnosed me with advanced aggressive dementia. The final sentence stated clearly and unequivocally that Richard Lawson was a direct and immediate danger to himself and to others. The evaluation highly recommended an immediate involuntary transfer to a secure, permanent psychiatric confinement facility. I lowered the papers and stared blankly out at the dusty road. The sheer evil of the backup plan was staggering. My son had covered every single base. He knew that the professional hitmen he hired might fail to eliminate me in the dark of the night. He needed a foolproof insurance policy right now. If the staged accident did not kill me, this fraudulent medical document was his ultimate weapon. Armed with this official psychiatric evaluation, Derek could walk into a courtroom tomorrow morning and be granted emergency medical conservatorship. He would instantly seize full power of attorney over my life. I would be legally stripped of my human rights in a matter of hours. I would be forcibly dragged from my own home by men in white coats and locked inside a padded room while my son finalized the fraudulent sale of my 30-acre farm. I would be buried completely alive forever. The developers were scheduled to arrive with their heavy commercial bulldozers on Monday morning. Derek needed me gone before the weekend was over. If the hitman failed tonight, he would arrive tomorrow with an ambulance and a court order. I would spend the rest of my miserable life heavily medicated, behind thick, locked doors, screaming that I was perfectly sane while the nurses shook their heads in pity. He would steal my $12 million and use it to escape his federal indictment, while I rotted away in a sterile white room, forgotten by the rest of the outside world. I carefully folded the fraudulent medical evaluation and slid it into the inner pocket of my heavy canvas jacket, right next to the forged county deed. These papers were the final nails in his coffin. My son thought he was playing a brilliant game of chess against a clueless old man. He thought he had trapped me in a corner with absolutely no way out. But he underestimated the man who raised him. I climbed back into the driver's seat of my truck and turned the heavy metal key. I was going to give him exactly what he completely deserved. I pulled my truck up to the farmhouse and parked it in the long shadow of the old barn. The afternoon was fading fast. The sky was turning a bruised shade of purple and orange. I walked into the quiet kitchen and set my keys on the counter. The house was exactly as I had left it. Silent. Empty. Waiting. I reached into my jacket and pulled out my cell phone. It was time to give my son the performance of a lifetime. I needed to convince him that his fabricated medical report was actually true. I needed him to believe that my mind was rapidly slipping away into the dark abyss of dementia. I pressed the speed dial for Derek and held the phone to my ear. It rang twice before he answered. He sounded tense and completely breathless, as if he had been pacing the floor of his luxury office. "Dad, where have you been? I have been calling you all day." His voice was laced with a thin layer of fake concern that masked his underlying panic. I did not answer him immediately. I let a long, heavy silence hang on the line. I slowed my breathing down. I relaxed my jaw and let my tongue go slightly numb. When I finally spoke, my voice was a weak and trembling rasp. "Derek, is that you?" I slurred the words together, dragging out the syllables. "Yes, Dad. It is me. Are you okay?" You sound terrible. I let out a confused and heavy sigh. I do not know, son. I feel so strange today. My head is entirely filled with thick fog. I woke up this morning, and I could not remember where Martha put my good work boots. I spent hours looking for them in the hall closet. I paused and let out a broken little laugh. Then I remembered Martha has been gone for a long time. Right. She passed away a long time ago. What year is it, Derek? Is it 2018? Through the phone receiver, I heard a sharp intake of breath. The sudden silence on his end was absolutely deafening. I could practically see the greedy wheels turning in his head. His father was finally breaking down just like the fake medical evaluation claimed. Dad, it is 2026. Are you feeling all right? Do you need me to call a doctor for you? His voice was suddenly incredibly smooth and reassuring. It was the voice of a predator realizing its prey was already bleeding out. No, doctors, I mumbled, rubbing my hand across my tired face. I just feel so exhausted. My bones ache, and my mind will not stop spinning. I cannot focus on a single thing. I needed to give him the final piece of the puzzle. I needed to clear the entire chessboard for his grand finale. Listen, Derek, I called to tell you that I canceled all my appointments. I fired the gardener this afternoon. I told him not to come back anymore. I do not want strangers walking around the property right now. They make me feel paranoid. I walked around the entire perimeter, and I locked all the heavy iron gates. I pulled the shades down on every single window in the house. I am completely sealed in. Nobody is coming over to bother me. I am just going to take my heavy prescription sleeping pills and stay in bed all weekend. I am going to sleep through the entire night and probably most of tomorrow. I just want the world to be quiet for a little while. The trap was fully set. I had just handed him a locked, isolated house and an unconscious victim. I had given him the perfect locked room scenario for a tragic accidental death. If he sent his professional hitmen tonight, they would have zero witnesses and absolutely no resistance. For a few agonizing seconds, the line was completely dead. He was weighing his options. He was calculating the massive payout against the terrible risk. And then I heard it. A soft, eager exhalation of pure, greedy relief. It was the sound of a man who had just won the lottery. Rest up, Dad. Sleep tight. His voice was dripping with a sickening, artificial warmth. You have been working hard your whole life. You deserve a long rest. Do not worry about a single thing. I will make sure you are taken care of. I promise everything is going to be handled. I will check on you tomorrow. Just close your eyes and go to sleep. He hung up the phone. The line clicked and went to a steady dial tone. I stood alone in the absolute silence of the big, empty kitchen. The fading sunlight had completely vanished, leaving the room bathed in long, thick shadows. I pulled the device away from my ear and stared at the dark screen. He did not say, "I love you." He did not offer to drive over and sit with his confused and elderly father. He simply told me to close my eyes and wait for the end. I placed the phone gently on the granite kitchen counter. My masterclass acting performance was officially over for the night. The weak and trembling old man vanished completely. I stood up straight and rolled my shoulders back. My mind was sharper than a razor blade. I walked down the long hallway toward the basement door. Mike Sullivan and his private security team were waiting for me downstairs. They had spent the entire afternoon wiring the living room with military-grade surveillance equipment. I slowly opened the heavy basement door and descended the creaking wooden stairs down into the cool darkness. It was time to prepare the fortress. Tonight, my own son was going to send violent monsters to my door. But he had absolutely no idea that he was sending them straight into the jaws of a sleeping dragon. The sun rose high over the Texas fields, bringing a warm and deceptively peaceful Saturday afternoon. I spent the morning resting and preparing my mind for the long night ahead. The house was dead quiet. Mike and his team were hidden in the reinforced basement monitoring the cameras. I was drinking coffee when a heavy vibration rattled the floorboards under my boots. It was a low mechanical rumble that did not belong near my farm. I stood up and walked to the window. Plumes of thick gray exhaust smoke were rising above the tree line. Two massive utility trucks with drilling equipment were rolling past my open front gate. They did not slow down or ask for permission. They drove right onto my fields, crushing the tall grass beneath their tires. They parked about 200 yards from the main house. 4 men wearing high-visibility vests and hard hats jumped out of the cabs. They began unloading heavy steel soil testing drills. They acted like they already owned the place, and according to the forged paper in my jacket, they genuinely believed they did. I walked down the hall and opened the hidden panel where Mike had his command center. He handed me a small black audio transmitter. It was no bigger than a quarter. I pinned it carefully inside the collar of my shirt, completely out of sight. I tested the microphone by tapping it twice. Mike gave me a thumbs up from the glowing screens. The audio feed was crystal clear and recording directly to his server. I grabbed my old shotgun from behind the heavy oak door. I checked the safety and threw the stock casually over my right shoulder. I stepped out onto the porch and let the door slam loudly behind me. I began the long walk across the open field toward the intruders. As I closed the distance, I let my posture sink. I dragged my boots slightly through the dirt. I let my jaw hang loose and widened my eyes to look completely bewildered. I was about to give the performance of my life to an audience of uninvited guests. When I was about 50 yards away, one of the men finally noticed me. He tapped the shoulder of a tall man holding a clipboard. The tall man turned around and frowned. He was clearly the lead project manager for the group. He wore expensive boots that had never seen actual mud. He marched toward me, holding up a hand to stop me. "Excuse me, sir, you cannot be out here," he shouted over the engines. "This is a private commercial construction site. We are conducting preliminary soil tests for a new subdivision. You need to step back behind the property line." I stopped walking and stared at him blankly. I let out a loud, confused laugh. "Private site," I yelled back, my voice shaking with elderly confusion and anger. "What the hell are you talking about, boy? This is my farm. I built that house with my own hands 30 years ago. I own this dirt, and I did not invite you here. Pack up your toys and get off my land before I call the sheriff." The manager looked at the shotgun on my shoulder and took a cautious step backward. His arrogant demeanor faltered slightly, but he quickly regained his composure. "Listen, old man, I do not want any trouble," he said, tight with frustration. "I know exactly who you are. You are Richard Lawson, but you do not own this land anymore. Your son and daughter-in-law sold this parcel to our firm a month ago. The deal is completely done. We paid $12 million into escrow, and we have the legal right to begin preparations today." I shook my head wildly and gripped the shotgun. "You are lying," I stammered, acting disoriented. "I never signed anything. I would never sell my home. Megan would never do that to me." The manager let out a sigh and pulled a printed email from his clipboard. "Look, sir, I was told you might be confused about the situation. Megan explicitly warned us about your mental decline. She guaranteed me personally that you would be safely moved out of this house and placed into a permanent facility by Sunday night. She said you have severe dementia, and we should ignore anything you say. I am sorry about your health, but we have a schedule to keep. Our bulldozers are arriving Monday morning to level that house. Please put the gun down and go inside before someone gets hurt." I stared directly at him, letting his poisonous words hang heavy in the warm afternoon air. He had just admitted everything on a crystal-clear federal wire. He had named Megan. He had confirmed the fraudulent sale. He had verified the exact timeline of their vicious conspiracy. The recording in my collar had captured every damning syllable. I lowered the shotgun and held it firmly across my chest. I dropped the confused old man act instantly. My voice turned completely cold and deadly serious. I do not care what Megan told you, I said, staring into his eyes. You are trespassing on my property. The deed you bought is a criminal forgery, and your $12 million is locked in frozen escrow. Now you have 30 seconds to get off my land before I start shooting your tires. The project manager froze. He saw the sudden clarity in my eyes. He realized instantly I was not a senile old man. He raised his hands and turned around, screaming at his crew to pack up. I stood my ground and watched them scramble. Within 3 minutes, the trucks were tearing down the dirt driveway, kicking up clouds of dust as they fled toward the highway. I turned around and walked slowly back to the silent farmhouse. I reached up and tapped the hidden microphone inside my collar. We finally had the ultimate, indisputable proof. I walked back into the house and locked the heavy front door behind me. I went straight down the wooden stairs into the basement where Mike was waiting. I unpinned the small black microphone from my collar and set it on the desk next to his glowing monitors. Mike looked at me and nodded. We played the audio back. The voice of the arrogant project manager filled the small underground room, clearly admitting to the fraudulent sale and my daughter-in-law and her criminal timeline. Mike stopped the recording and saved it to 3 encrypted hard drives. We finally had the indisputable proof. But it was not enough to just stop the bulldozers tomorrow morning. We needed to catch the puppet master himself tonight. I looked at Mike and told him it was time to lock down the house. We were not just going to survive the night. We were going to produce a 4K resolution movie of my son's treason. Mike pulled out a satellite phone and sent an encrypted text message. Less than 20 minutes later, I saw 3 dark figures moving silently through the woods at the back of my property. It was his elite private security team. They did not drive up the main road. They hiked 2 miles through the thick brush carrying heavy black tactical cases, so my son would not see any strange vehicles if he had spotters watching the front gate. I opened the heavy back door and let them inside. There were 2 men and 1 woman. They moved with the quiet, brutal efficiency of military veterans. Nobody spoke a word. Mike just pointed to the living room, and they immediately went to work. They opened their heavy cases and pulled out coils of thin black wire and dozens of microscopic camera lenses. This was not the cheap wireless security system Derek had installed to spy on me. This was military-grade surveillance equipment designed to capture perfect high-definition video in complete darkness. I watched as the tall man carefully drilled tiny holes into the crown molding near the ceiling. He embedded miniature lenses into the wood and covered them with a thin layer of dust. The woman removed the covers from my electrical outlets and wired small sensitive microphones directly into the walls. They placed another camera inside the hollowed-out spine of a thick, hardcover book sitting on my shelf. Every single inch of the living room was covered from multiple angles. If a mouse scurried across the floor in the pitch-black night, they would capture its heartbeat in perfect audio and ultra-high-definition video. While the team handled the electronics, Mike and I both focused on the room. I am a master builder, and I know exactly how to manipulate a physical space to control the people inside of it. I told Mike I wanted to control exactly where the intruders stepped when they came through the front door. We moved the heavy leather sofas and the solid oak coffee table just a few inches, creating a subtle but forced funnel. When Derek and his hired thugs walked into the room in the dark, their natural instincts would force them to walk right into the center of our surveillance web. They would have no cover and absolutely nowhere to hide. Then we moved to the heavy oak front door. This was the most important part of the trap. Once they stepped inside my house, I could not let them turn around and run away when the lights came on. I wanted them locked inside a cage of their own making. Mike handed me a heavy electric drill. We completely removed the standard brass hinges from the door frame. We replaced them with specialized reinforced steel hinges that Mike had brought in his tactical case. These hinges were wired directly into a small hidden battery pack. Next, we installed a heavy-duty magnetic locking mechanism inside the top of the door frame. It was completely invisible from the outside. The second the door swung shut behind them, Mike could press a button on his tablet and trigger the electromagnet. It would take a battering ram to open that door from the inside once the lock was engaged. They were going to walk right into a steel vault. By 6:06 in the evening, the physical preparations were completely finished. The living room looked exactly the same as it had yesterday. It looked like the quiet, lonely home of a tired old man. But beneath the surface, it was a highly lethal trap waiting to snap shut. The security team gathered all their cases and retreated down into the basement with Mike. They set up a fortified viewing room at the bottom of the stairs. They arranged 4 large monitors on a folding table. The screens displayed perfect, crystal-clear feeds of my living room, my front porch, and my long dirt driveway. Even with the lights completely turned off upstairs, the infrared lenses illuminated the rooms with a sharp, bright clarity. I stood in the basement looking at the glowing monitors. My hands were steady and my breathing was calm. Mike walked over and handed me my old Remington shotgun. He looked me right in the eye. He told me that his team was armed and ready to breach the stairs the exact second things went wrong. He promised me that nobody was going to lay a single finger on me tonight. I took the heavy weapon from his hands and thanked him. I told him I was not afraid of the men my son was sending. I was only afraid of what I was going to see in the eyes of my own boy when the lights finally turned on. The sun was setting outside, casting the farmhouse into complete darkness. The stage was perfectly set. Now all we had to do was wait for the devil to knock on the front door. Sunday morning arrived with a cold and bitter wind sweeping across the open fields of the farm. The entire day stretched out before me like an endless desert of time. I did not leave the house. I did not step foot outside onto the porch. I stayed inside the fortified walls of my home, pacing the hardwood floors and waiting for the sun to go down. The security team remained perfectly silent down in the basement. They ate cold rations and kept their eyes glued to the dark monitors. The house was completely still. It felt like a massive tomb waiting to be sealed. I spent hours sitting in my leather recliner staring at the heavy reinforced front door. I thought about the decades of my life spent building this place. I thought about the sweat and the blood I poured into the foundation. And I thought about the boy I had raised, who was coming to tear it all down. As the afternoon bled into the evening, the temperature dropped significantly. The sky turned a deep shade of bruised purple before finally fading into absolute pitch black. I turned off every single light in the living room. I turned off the television. I unplugged the grandfather clock in the hallway so its heavy chiming would not echo through the empty rooms. The silence was heavy and suffocating. It pressed against my eardrums like a physical weight. I sat in the darkness wearing my heavy canvas jacket and my steel-toe work boots. The old Remington shotgun was resting safely behind the front door, exactly where I would need it. Down below my feet, the basement was a hive of quiet, tactical activity. But up here in the living room, I was entirely alone with my thoughts. I was waiting for the final green light. I was waiting for my son to make the call that would end his life as a free man. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. 8:00 passed without a sound. 9:00 vanished into the dark. By 10:00, my heart was beating with a slow and steady rhythm. I was not afraid anymore. The fear had been completely burned out of my system, leaving nothing but a cold and absolute resolve. I watched the digital clock on the kitchen stove glowing with bright red numbers. 10:30, 10:45, 10:50. My son was a creature of absolute habit. He liked things to be precise and organized. I knew he would not send his men into the dark until he had absolute confirmation that the target was isolated and vulnerable. I kept my cellular phone resting on the arm of my leather chair. My hand hovered just an inch above the dark screen, waiting for the trap to spring. The red numbers on the stove flipped to exactly 11:00. Almost instantly, the quiet darkness of the living room was shattered by a sharp mechanical vibration. The cell phone lit up, casting a pale blue glow across my weathered hands. The screen displayed the name of my son, Derek. My stomach tightened into a hard knot. This was it. This was the point of no return. If I answered this call and gave him the wrong answer, he might call off the hit, and the federal trap would fall apart. I had to give him the absolute perfect performance. I closed my eyes and took a long, deep breath. I let my shoulders slump. I relaxed the muscles in my neck and jaw. I picked up the glowing phone and pressed the green button. I brought the speaker to my ear, but I did not say a word. I just breathed heavily into the microphone. "Dad, are you there?" His voice came through the small speaker. It sounded remarkably clear and completely hollow. There was no warmth in his tone. There was no hesitation. It was the voice of a man conducting a brutal business transaction. I let out a weak and trembling cough before I answered him. "Yes, Derek, I am here." I slurred my words together, making my voice sound incredibly tired and frail. "I told you I was going to sleep through the weekend. Why are you calling me so late in the night?" "I just want to rest." Then came the question. The same 4 words he had asked me every single night for the last month. The words that used to make me smile because I thought he actually cared about my safety. "Dad, are you alone?" He asked the question slowly, emphasizing every single syllable. He needed to be absolutely certain. He needed the verbal contract to be finalized before he sent his killers. I closed my eyes in the dark. I pictured his arrogant face sitting in his luxury apartment downtown, waiting to send monsters to my door. "Yes, son," I whispered into the phone. "Just me. I am all alone in the big house. I locked the doors and turned off the lights hours ago. I feel so incredibly weak today, Derek. I took my heavy sleeping pills and I can barely keep my eyes open. I am going to put the phone down now and go to sleep." A heavy silence stretched across the cellular connection. It lasted for only 3 seconds, but it felt like a lifetime. I could hear the faint sound of city traffic in the background on his end. I could hear his steady and controlled breathing. He had everything he needed. The trap was clear. The old man was drugged and completely isolated. He had the green light to initiate the final phase of his criminal conspiracy. "Good night, Dad," he said softly. The false sweetness in his voice made my skin crawl. "Sleep tight. I will make sure you are taken care of." The line went completely dead. The call was over. He did not wait for me to say goodbye. I pulled the phone away from my ear and set it face down on the leather armrest. I sat in the silent, dark room for exactly 1 minute, letting the reality of the situation settle over me. My son had just signed his own federal death warrant. I stood up from my chair and walked silently down the hallway toward the basement door. My heavy boots made absolutely no sound on the hardwood floor. I opened the door and walked down the wooden stairs into the blue light of the Security Command Center. Mike was standing over the folding table, staring intently at the 4 glowing monitors. The 3 members of his tactical team were already geared up, wearing their dark protective vests and holding their weapons at the ready. I walked over and stood right next to Mike. He did not say a word. He just raised his hand and pointed a thick finger at the top left monitor. The screen displayed the infrared camera feed from my front gate. I watched as the small digital motion sensor icon flashed bright red in the corner of the screen. 2 dark vehicles with their headlights completely turned off were slowly pulling onto the dirt driveway. Mike tapped the monitor and looked at me. "They just tripped the gate sensors," he whispered. "Our guests have arrived." I stared at the glowing monitor as 2 dark vehicles slowly crept up the long gravel driveway. They cut their engines about 50 yards from the main house and let the heavy trucks coast to a silent stop behind the old wooden barn. The infrared cameras picked up the glowing heat signatures of 3 men stepping out into the cold night air. They moved with cautious and practiced precision, staying extremely low to the ground and avoiding the open patches of bright moonlight. My chest felt entirely hollow. I was watching a tactical military operation being executed against my own home. Mike tapped a few keys on his diagnostic laptop, switching the primary visual feed to the hidden camera mounted directly above the front porch. The three figures glided up the wooden steps. They did not make a single sound. The weathered floorboards that usually creaked under my heavy work boots remained perfectly silent under their careful and deliberate footfalls. As they approached the heavy oak front door, the high-definition camera angle captured their faces in crisp and undeniable detail. Two of the men were wearing thick black ski masks pulled tightly over their heads. They were built like brick walls, clad entirely in dark tactical clothing and thick leather gloves. The massive man on the left gripped a heavy forged iron pipe wrench in his right hand. The second man on the right carried a bulky and modified steel gas canister, securely strapped across his broad chest. But it was the third man standing between them that made the blood in my veins run completely cold. Standing right there in the center of the masked killers was my own son. Derek was not wearing a mask to hide his face. He was wearing a dark designer jacket and a black baseball cap pulled down low over his nervous eyes. He looked pale and absolutely terrified, but his jaw was set with a grim and murderous determination. I watched him reach into his jacket pocket and pull out a shiny silver house key. It was the exact same silver key I had given to him 5 years ago. I gave it to him so he would always have a safe place to come home to whenever he needed shelter. Now he was using that symbol of a father's love to let ruthless murderers into my quiet sanctuary. He slid the metal key into the brass deadbolt and turned it slowly to avoid making any noise. The sensitive microphone embedded in the porch wall picked up the sharp metallic click of the heavy lock finally disengaging. The thick oak door swung inward, and the three men stepped cautiously into my pitch-black living room. Mike instantly dragged his finger across his glowing tablet, switching all the monitors to the interior cameras we had meticulously installed just hours ago. The living room was completely invisible to the naked eye, but on our digital screens it was illuminated in a bright and ghostly white landscape. Derek stepped inside the house first. He held his shaking hand up in the air, signaling the two masked men behind him to pause and wait. He carefully reached behind his back and pushed the heavy oak door shut. It closed with a very solid and final thud that echoed softly through the empty house. Mike looked over at me and hovered his finger directly over the red button that would instantly activate the magnetic steel lock, but he waited. We absolutely needed to capture their full malicious intent on the federal recording before we finally sprung the trap. We needed the audio confession to be completely bulletproof in a court of law. The hidden microphones scattered throughout the room were so incredibly sensitive that I could hear the thick fabric of their dark jackets rustling. I could hear the heavy and nervous breathing of my son echoing through the speakers. He stood awkwardly in the center of the living room, frantically looking around the dark and empty space. He was standing exactly where we had forced him to stand by shifting the heavy leather sofas earlier that afternoon. He was completely exposed without any cover, caught directly in the crosshairs of 5 different high-definition military lenses. Derek turned his head toward the massive man holding the heavy iron pipe wrench. He pointed a trembling finger down the dark hallway, gesturing directly toward my closed master bedroom door. His voice came through the basement speakers in a harsh and frantic whisper that dripped with pure poison. Make it look like he left the kitchen stove on and passed out. Break the main gas line behind the oven first. I want this entire place leveled to the ground. Those vicious words hit me like physical blows to my stomach. Hearing about a theoretical murder plot is one thing, but watching your own flesh and blood stand in your living room and give the explicit order to burn you alive is a pain I cannot adequately describe. It is a profound and soul-crushing emotional agony. He did not just want me quietly dead in my sleep. He wanted to violently erase every single trace of my existence from the face of the earth. He wanted the beautiful home I built for his mother reduced to a pile of smoldering black ash. The man holding the heavy gas canister nodded his head and whispered back in a low and gravelly voice, Are you absolutely sure the old man is completely asleep? We do not want him waking up and making a noise when we snap the metal pipe. If he fights back and struggles, there will be obvious blunt force trauma on the body. The fire investigators will easily find the skull fractures during the autopsy. It has to look like a perfectly clean accident, or we do not get the rest of our money. Derek swallowed hard and wiped the sweat from his forehead. I am positive. He took one more step forward into the center of the dark living room. The two giant masked men followed right behind him, their boots heavy against the hardwood floor. They were fully committed now. They had crossed the threshold of my home with the explicit intent to murder me and burn my legacy to the ground. Down in the basement, Mike did not hesitate for another fraction of a second. He slammed his hand down onto the red digital button glowing on his tablet screen. The trap finally snapped shut. Behind the three men, the heavy oak front door suddenly swung backward with terrifying speed. It slammed into the reinforced steel doorframe with a deafening crash that shook the walls of the entire house. Instantly, the high-powered magnetic locking mechanism engaged. It sounded like a massive iron vault sealing shut. A sharp, heavy metallic clack echoed through the room. The sudden noise hit the three men like a physical shockwave. The massive thug holding the heavy iron pipe wrench spun around so fast he nearly lost his balance. He lunged toward the front door and grabbed the brass handle, violently jerking it backward. He pulled with all of his massive upper body strength, planting his heavy boots against the floorboards for leverage. The thick muscles in his back strained against his tactical jacket, but the door did not even budge a single millimeter. It was absolutely fused to the steel frame by thousands of pounds of electromagnetic pressure. The second thug dropped the modified gas canister onto the floor with a loud metallic clatter. He rushed to help his partner. Both of the masked killers grabbed the handle and yanked with everything they had. They cursed loudly into the pitch-black darkness, panic completely taking over their previously disciplined movements. They realized instantly that they were no longer the hunters creeping into a quiet house. They were rats trapped inside a heavy steel cage. Derek stumbled backward, his hands raised in front of his face as if he were trying to ward off a ghost. He spun around in circles, his eyes wide and terrified, trying to pierce through the suffocating darkness of the living room. He had absolutely no idea what had just happened. He thought the wind had blown the door shut. He thought the old lock had jammed. His arrogant brain simply could not process the reality that his senile, drugged father had just outsmarted him. I sat perfectly still in my worn leather recliner, entirely invisible in the thick shadows. I watched their pathetic panic for a few long, satisfying moments. I listened to their heavy breathing and their desperate curses. Then I slowly reached forward and let my voice cut through the darkness. You always were terrible at construction, Derek. My voice was calm, deep, and completely steady. It did not shake with elderly frailty. It did not slur with the heavy weight of prescription sleeping pills. It echoed through the dark living room with the cold, hard authority of a master builder inspecting a structurally flawed project. The three men froze instantly. The two thugs released the door handle and slowly turned around, raising their heavy hands defensively. Derek stood absolutely paralyzed in the center of the room, his jaw hanging open in sheer disbelief. You do not know the first thing about breaking a main gas line. I continued my words, landing like heavy stones in the silent room. If you snap the intake valve behind the oven, the way you just described, the emergency safety regulator automatically triggers a shut-off flap. It chokes the oxygen supply in less than 4 seconds. You would not get a massive explosion. You would just get a small flash fire that barely scorches the kitchen cabinets. I designed this house to survive 5 tornadoes and floods. Did you honestly think you could bring it down with a cheap wrench and a stolen canister? Suddenly, a blinding beam of pure white light cut through the black room. Mike had activated a single high-intensity tactical spotlight mounted near the ceiling, directly above my chair. The bright circle of light slammed down over me, illuminating exactly where I was sitting. I was not wearing pajamas. I was not lying unconscious in my bed. I was sitting completely upright in my heavy leather armchair. I wore my thick canvas work jacket and my heavy steel toe boots. Resting perfectly flat across my knees, gleaming softly under the bright tactical light, was my loaded 12-gauge Remington shotgun. My right hand was wrapped firmly around the wooden grip, and my index finger was resting lightly against the cold metal trigger. I looked directly into the terrified eyes of my 42-year-old son. The two masked hitmen took one look at the heavy weapon resting on my lap and instantly calculated their odds. They did not raise their heavy wrench. They did not reach for the gas canister. They slowly raised their gloved hands high into the air, stepping away from Derek and pressing their backs against the wooden wall. They were paid to stage a quiet accident, not to engage in a deadly shootout with a prepared and heavily armed homeowner. But Derek could not accept reality. His massive ego simply refused to acknowledge that his perfect plan had completely disintegrated. Even now, caught red-handed in the middle of a confirmed assassination attempt, staring down the barrel of a loaded shotgun, he tried to lie his way out. He swallowed the sheer terror in his throat and forced a pathetic, trembling mask of concern onto his face. He took a slow, shaking step forward into the edge of the bright light. He reached his hands out toward me, his voice pitching high with fabricated relief. "Dad," he cried out, forcing a fake sob into his chest. "Thank God you are awake. These horrible men broke into the house while I was driving by to check on you. I followed them inside to stop them. Put the gun down, Dad. I am here to save you." It was the most disgusting, cowardly lie I had ever heard in my entire life. He actually thought I was still that blindly loving father who would believe anything he said. He thought he could gaslight me one final time right here in the very room where he had just ordered my brutal execution. I stared at his pale, sweating face, analyzing the desperate twitch in his left eye and the awkward, rigid posture of his trembling body. He was gambling his entire life on the assumption that my paternal love would override my basic common sense. He thought the fake medical record and the forged land deed were still secrets locked away in the dark. He had absolutely no idea about the vast mountain of federal evidence resting securely in the basement right below his expensive shoes. I did not raise the barrel of the shotgun. I did not yell. I just let his pathetic words hang in the freezing air, waiting for the final curtain to drop. I sat perfectly still in the circle of bright light, while my son desperately tried to sell me his final pathetic lie. He held his hands out toward me, acting like the devoted child who had just rushed in to save his elderly father from a violent home invasion. I looked at the complete lack of genuine emotion in his empty eyes. The silence in the room became heavy and suffocating. Derek took another hesitant step forward, trying to close the distance between us. He opened his mouth to speak again, to weave another layer of deception into his web of treason. But I did not give him the chance to utter another single syllable. I slowly moved my left hand away from the wooden stock of the Remington shotgun. I reached deep into the heavy canvas pocket of my work jacket and wrapped my fingers around the small plastic remote transmitter that Mike had given me earlier that afternoon. I looked right into the terrified eyes of my son, and I pressed the red button. Instantly, the entire living room exploded into blinding brilliance. Every single tactical light that Mike and his security team had hidden along the crown molding flared to life at the exact same time. The pitch-black darkness was violently ripped away, replaced by an overwhelming wave of pure white illumination. The sudden flash was so incredibly intense that Derek cried out in pain and threw his arms up over his face, stumbling backward against the heavy wooden coffee table. The two massive thugs behind him groaned and squeezed their eyes shut, completely blinded and disoriented by the sudden artificial daylight. The shadows where they thought they could hide and commit murder were completely eradicated. Before their eyes could even adjust to the blinding light, the heavy sliding doors to the adjoining kitchen violently slammed open. The reinforced door leading to the basement hallway was kicked completely off its hinges. The cavalry had arrived. From the kitchen, Mike Sullivan stepped into the living room, holding a heavy tactical rifle secured firmly against his shoulder. Right behind him were the 3 members of his elite private security team, moving with terrifying military precision. They spread out across the room in a perfect tactical formation. 3 bright red laser sights instantly cut through the cold air and settled directly on the chests of the intruders. Mike did not shout. He simply chambered around with a loud mechanical clack that echoed through the entire house. But the private security team was only the first wave of the nightmare I had prepared for my son. From the long hallway leading to the bedrooms, another group of men stepped into the brilliant light. Leading the way was my ruthless attorney, Benjamin Carter. He wore a dark, heavy overcoat, and his face was set in a mask of absolute cold fury. He stood tall, holding a thick manila folder in his left hand, and stepping out from behind Benjamin were 3 massive federal agents. They wore heavy, dark tactical vests with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation emblazoned across their chests. Their service weapons were drawn and locked onto the targets. The heavy brass badges on their belts reflected the harsh tactical lights, shining like beacons of absolute justice. The 2 hired hitmen were violent criminals, but they were not stupid. They took one look at the overwhelming display of lethal force surrounding them and immediately understood that their lives were completely over. They realized in a fraction of a second that they had not walked into an easy job. They had walked into a meticulously orchestrated federal sting operation. The massive thug on the left slowly opened his hands. The heavy forged iron pipe wrench slipped from his fingers and crashed loudly against the hardwood floor. The second thug immediately followed suit. He slowly sank to his knees, lacing his thick fingers tightly behind his head and staring down at the floorboards. Federal agents, do not move. Drop to the ground, right now. The lead FBI agent barked the command with a voice that rattled the glass in the window frames. The 2 thugs immediately flattened themselves against the floor, spreading their arms and legs wide in total submission. 2 of the federal agents rushed forward, their heavy boots thudding against the wood. They aggressively pinned the massive men to the ground, pulling their arms back and securing their wrists with thick plastic zip ties. The men who came to break my gas line and burn my legacy to ashes were neutralized in less than 30 seconds without a single shot being fired. And then there was Derek. My son was left standing completely alone in the center of the brightly lit room. The 2 monsters he had hired were currently lying face down in the dirt, at his feet bound, and entirely defeated. The red laser sights from the security team shifted seamlessly away from the thugs and settled directly onto his expensive designer jacket. Derek slowly lowered his hands from his face and looked around the room. He looked at the heavily armed private security contractors. He looked at the federal agents securing the perimeter. And finally, his terrified eyes locked onto Benjamin Carter, the ruthless lawyer he knew held the absolute power to destroy his fraudulent life. I watched the devastating realization wash over his pale face. The look of arrogant invincibility completely melted away. It dissolved like snow on a hot stove, replaced by a profound and absolute soul-crushing terror. His knees began to physically tremble inside his tailored slacks. He opened his mouth to speak, to try and spin another lie, to claim he was the victim, but his vocal cords completely failed him. He let out a pathetic, broken gasp that sounded like a dying animal. He realized that every single move he had made, every phone call, every forged signature, and every whispered threat had been completely anticipated and documented. He was not the puppet master pulling the strings. He was the rat trapped inside the maze, and the steel doors had just permanently locked behind him. The heavy silence in the room was finally broken by the sharp metallic sound of steel handcuffs locking securely into place. The 2 federal agents hauled the massive hitmen up from the hardwood floor. They patted them down with rough efficiency, pulling an assortment of concealed blades and lockpicking tools from their heavy tactical jackets. The men offered absolutely zero resistance. They kept their eyes firmly fixed on the ground, completely accepting their total defeat. Mike Sullivan lowered his rifle and signaled for his security team to step back, clearing the center of the room. Benjamin Carter stood by the broken kitchen door, his face a mask of absolute legal judgment. The stage was now entirely cleared for the final act. Derek looked at the federal agents dragging his hired muscle out through the kitchen. His legs finally gave out. He collapsed onto the floor, his knees hitting the hardwood with a dull thud. The arrogant tech startup director, the man who drove imported sports cars and wore custom-tailored suits, was reduced to a pathetic, weeping mess. He buried his face in his trembling hands and began to sob loudly. It was not the crying of a man who felt genuine remorse for trying to murder his own father. It was the frantic, desperate crying of a selfish child who had just realized he was going to spend the rest of his life inside a federal prison cell. He looked up at me, his face red and slick with sweat and tears. "Dad, please, you have to help me," he begged, his voice cracking violently. "They made me do it. The investors, they are dangerous people. They threatened to kill me if I did not pay them back by Wednesday. I did not want to hurt you, I swear. I was just trying to survive. They forced me into a corner. You have to tell the FBI that this is a terrible misunderstanding. Please, Dad, I am your son. You cannot let them take me away. You know I would never intentionally cause you any harm." I did not flinch. I did not lower the barrel of my shotgun. I looked down at the weeping, trembling creature on the floor and felt absolutely nothing. The deep, unconditional paternal love that had driven me to work double shifts in the blistering Texas sun to pay for his private schooling was completely gone. It had been violently burned away by his greed, leaving behind a cold and impenetrable wall of iron. I slowly stood up from my leather armchair. I placed the Remington shotgun down on the seat cushion. I reached my rough, calloused hand into the deep inside pocket of my heavy canvas work jacket. I pulled out a thick stack of folded papers. I walked slowly across the living room, my steel toe boots echoing softly against the wood. I stopped just a few feet away from where Derek was kneeling. I looked down at him, my expression completely flat. I unfolded the first document. It was the printed email containing his frantic communications with the unsaved number. I let it slip from my fingers. It fluttered down and landed right on his expensive shoes. Then I pulled out the fraudulent medical evaluation from the expensive psychiatric clinic. I dropped it down next to the first paper. Finally, I pulled out the forged county land deed featuring the perfect copy of my signature and his wife's notary stamp. I threw it forcefully, letting the heavy legal pages scatter across the floor, completely surrounding his trembling knees. Derek stared down at the documents. His breath hitched in his throat. He recognized the psychiatric report. He recognized the forged deed. He realized that I knew absolutely everything. "You were not forced into a corner, Derek," I said, my voice cutting through the room with absolute lethal precision. "You made a conscious choice. You ran a fraudulent Ponzi scheme because you were too greedy to work a real job. You stole millions of dollars to fund your luxurious lifestyle, and when the federal government caught you, you decided that my life was the perfect price to pay for your freedom. You did not hire these men tonight because you were threatened. You hired them because you wanted my $12 million. I took a step closer, towering over him in the bright, tactical light. You sold my blood and sweat for $12 million. I continued, the anger finally bleeding into my words. You looked at this farm at the home I built for your mother, and you saw nothing but a massive paycheck. But you forgot exactly who built you. You forgot where you came from. I am a builder, Derek. I know how to lay a solid foundation, and I know exactly where to hit to make a crooked, rotting structure completely collapse. You thought you were outsmarting a clueless, senile old man. You thought my age made me weak, but my age gave me the patience to watch you dig your own grave. Derek reached out a shaking hand, trying to grab the hem of my jacket. Dad, please, I am sorry. I am so sorry. I stepped back, pulling out of his reach. Do not call me that. I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. A son loves his father. A son protects his family. You are nothing but a thief and a coward who hid in the dark while paying strangers to do your bloody work. You plotted to lock me inside a psychiatric ward. You ordered men to break a gas line and burn my legacy to the ground. You have disgraced the name I gave you. You are no longer my son. I have absolutely no family left in that city. I turned my back on him. I looked over at Benjamin Carter and gave him a single firm nod. Benjamin stepped forward and motioned to the lead federal agent. The agent walked up behind Derek, grabbed his arms, and forcefully pulled him up from the floor. The sound of a third set of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting shut echoed through the bright living room. Derek screamed, thrashing wildly against the firm grip of the agent, begging for mercy, crying out for his mother, crying out for the father he had just tried to murder. But his desperate cries fell on completely deaf ears. I walked back to my leather armchair and sat down, staring blankly at the far wall as they dragged him away. The ultimate payoff was complete. The poison had been entirely extracted from my life. The house was quiet again, but this time I was truly safe. I remained in the leather armchair and listened to the heavy footsteps echoing down the front porch steps. I slowly stood up and walked over to the large bay window. I pulled back the heavy curtain just enough to look out into the cold Texas night. The front yard was bathed in the flashing red and blue lights of multiple federal cruisers. The silence of the countryside was shattered by police radios. I watched through the glass as two federal agents dragged my weeping son across the grass. His designer jacket was torn, and his expensive slacks were covered in dust. He was no longer trying to fight them. He had completely surrendered to the crushing weight of his own absolute failure. His head hung low against his chest as they carried him to the back of a black armored SUV. They pushed him into the dark back seat and slammed the heavy door shut, sealing his fate forever. A few minutes later, the federal convoy drove down the dirt driveway and disappeared onto the main highway, taking the darkest chapter of my life away with it. The flashing lights faded into the distance, leaving the farm in complete peace. Mike Sullivan and his team stayed for another hour, packing up their military-grade surveillance equipment. They worked with quiet efficiency, leaving absolutely no trace that my living room had just been a federal sting operation. Mike stopped by the front door before he left. He just offered a firm nod of respect and told me he would be checking the perimeter cameras every single night from his office downtown. Benjamin Carter left shortly after assuring me that the legal nightmare was unwinding in our favor. I finally went to bed that night, and for the first time in over a month, I slept the deep and dreamless sleep of a truly free man. When Monday morning arrived, the brutal reality of the federal justice system descended upon the conspiracy. At exactly 9:00, the busy downtown financial district was thrown into total chaos. A fleet of unmarked federal vehicles swarmed the glass tower where my daughter-in-law Megan worked. A dozen armed federal agents wearing tactical vests marched straight through the revolving doors, completely ignoring the panicked security guards. They rode the elevators up to the luxury real estate brokerage and stormed the polished marble lobby. Megan was in the middle of a high-profile meeting with two extremely wealthy foreign investors, pitching them another massive commercial property. She was wearing her pristine white blazer and her perfect fake smile. The lead federal agent kicked the glass door of her conference room open and loudly announced the execution of a federal arrest warrant. He listed her charges in front of the entire office: wire fraud, forgery, conspiracy to commit murder. The wealthy clients gasped in absolute horror and immediately scrambled out of the room. Megan went completely pale, her arrogant facade violently shattered into a million pieces. She began to scream hysterically, demanding to call her lawyers and threatening to sue the federal government for ruining her reputation. But the agents did not care about her threats. They grabbed her wrists, twisted them behind her back, and locked the cold steel handcuffs into place. They marched her out of the glass office and paraded her through the crowded marble lobby for every single one of her envious colleagues to witness. Her perfect designer heels stumbled and scraped against the floor as she wept in total, absolute humiliation. Her lucrative career was instantly destroyed, and her future was reduced to a concrete cell. While Megan was being booked into federal custody, Benjamin Carter was already executing the final phase of our counterattack. He scheduled an emergency meeting with the executive board of the Commercial Development Group. These were the men who had sent the bulldozers to my property on Saturday, assuming they owned my land. They arrived at Benjamin's office looking angry and demanding answers about the hostile encounter they had experienced at the farm. Benjamin did not waste any time arguing with them. He simply opened his heavy leather briefcase and slid the entire stack of federal evidence across the mahogany conference table. He showed them the forged deed with the fraudulent notary stamp. He played the crystal-clear audio recording of their own project manager, openly admitting that Megan had guaranteed the illegal removal of a senile old man. He handed them a copy of the unsealed federal indictment, detailing the exact criminal conspiracy orchestrated by my son. The executives stared at the documents in absolute stunned silence. The arrogant anger completely drained from their faces, replaced by the terrifying realization that they were directly implicated in a massive federal crime. Benjamin leaned forward and delivered the final legal blow. He informed them that the $12 million fraudulent sale was officially voided by the county court that very morning. Their money was securely frozen in the federal escrow account, pending a massive investigation. However, Benjamin offered them a single extremely expensive lifeline. He told them that I was still willing to sell the 30 acres of prime real estate, but I was no longer going to sell it for $12 million. Because of the incredible stress and the criminal trespassing they had engaged in, the new purchase price was legally set at exactly $15 million in completely clean liquid funds. The developers were absolutely desperate. They had already invested millions of dollars into the zoning permits and the preliminary architectural blueprints for the massive luxury subdivision. If they lost the Lawson farm, their entire corporate portfolio would suffer a catastrophic collapse. They looked at Benjamin Carter, and they looked at the mountain of federal evidence sitting on the table. They knew they had absolutely no leverage left. They immediately agreed to the new terms without a single complaint. The fraudulent nightmare was completely erased, and the legal cleanup was an absolute total victory. 3 months have passed since that cold and violent night in my living room. The wheels of federal justice turn slowly, but they grind exceptionally fine. Derek and Megan are currently sitting in separate federal detention centers awaiting their final sentencing. They tried to turn against each other during the early interrogations, just like Benjamin Carter predicted. Megan claimed Derek forced her to forge the notary stamp and arrange the real estate deal. Derek cried to the investigators, claiming Megan manipulated his massive debt to steal the land. But the federal prosecutors did not care about their pathetic finger-pointing. They had the forged documents. They had the intercepted emails. They had the crystal-clear audio recording from the trespassing project manager. And most importantly, they had the high-definition video from my living room, showing Derek actively directing armed hitmen to burn me alive. The evidence was an absolute ironclad mountain. Their expensive defense lawyers took one look at the federal file and advised them to take a plea deal to avoid spending their entire natural lives behind bars. They are both facing a mandatory minimum of 20 years in federal prison for wire fraud forgery and conspiracy to commit murder. The shiny technology startup was completely dismantled by the government, and the stolen money is slowly being returned to the victims. Their luxury cars were seized. Their massive house in the city was liquidated. They lost absolutely everything because they tried to steal the one thing that did not belong to them. With the criminal conspiracy completely destroyed, I was finally able to move forward with my own life. I did not want to stay on the farm anymore. The memories of my late wife, Martha, were still beautiful, but the land itself had been tainted by the greed of my son. It was time to close that long chapter and start a completely new one. Benjamin Carter formalized the new legal contract with the commercial developers. They paid the renegotiated price of $15 million in completely clean and verified funds. I stood on the front porch of my old farmhouse one last time, looking out over the sprawling 30 acres I had cultivated with my own 2 hands. I felt a profound sense of peace. I had protected my home when it mattered most. I packed my bags and drove away without shedding a single tear. I used a small fraction of the massive payout to buy a comfortable and highly secure single-story home in a quiet neighborhood just 2 blocks away from Mike Sullivan. My old friend and I drink coffee on the porch every morning, swapping stories about the old construction days. I do not have to worry about the dark shadows anymore. My new house is fully equipped with an advanced security system that I completely control. I sleep deeply every single night, knowing that the people who wanted to harm me are locked away in concrete cells. But I knew I could not just sit in a comfortable chair and hoard $15 million. I am a master builder, and I have always believed that wealth should be used to construct a better future. I thought about the sheer entitlement of my son. He was handed every possible advantage, and he chose to become a parasite. I wanted to use my money to help young people who possessed the exact opposite character. I worked closely with Benjamin Carter to establish a massive educational trust fund. We officially named it the Martha Lawson Foundation, in honor of the woman who supported me when I had absolutely nothing. The foundation is specifically designed to provide full-ride trade school scholarships for young men and women who actually want to work hard for a living. We pay for their tuition, their heavy tools, and their living expenses, while they learn how to become certified electricians, master plumbers, and skilled carpenters. Instead of throwing my money away on arrogant tech executives in tailored suits, I am investing in calloused hands and strong backs. I am investing in kids who know the true value of an honest day's work. Last week, I attended the graduation ceremony for our very first class of scholarship recipients. Watching those proud young men and women walk across the stage holding their trade certificates filled my heart with an overwhelming joy. They are the family I chose to build. They are the legacy that will carry my name forward long after I am gone from this world. The pain of betrayal is a heavy burden to carry, but it is also a profound teacher. I spent decades believing that my ultimate duty as a father was to unconditionally protect the boy I brought into this world, regardless of his terrible actions. I thought that shielding him from the harsh consequences of his own mistakes was an act of parental love. But true love requires strict boundaries. True love demands respect and absolute accountability. By standing up to my vicious son, I did not just save my own physical life. I stopped a highly dangerous predator from ever hurting anyone else again in the future. I completely reclaimed my own personal dignity and proved that the undeniable strength of a human spirit does not simply fade away with age. We are never defined by the terrible people who betray us. We are defined by exactly how we choose to rebuild our shattered lives after the dark storm has finally passed. I found a new purpose in helping others. I learned that true wealth is measured by the positive impact you leave behind on the next generation. Blood does not make a family, respect does. Do not ever let anyone convince you that your age makes you obsolete. If you built your life, you have the right to defend it. Hit the like button, send a super thanks if this story gave you strength, and I will see you in the next one.